All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second sustainability webinar organized by E-SWAN, the European Space Weather and Space Climate Association. As a scientist in space weather and space climate, but also elsewhere, we are not only observing our physical environment, but we have unfortunately also an impact on it. And therefore it's appropriate to question the sustainability of space sciences. Today's speaker is Dr. Vanessa Moss. She's a radio astronomer based in CSIRO, the Space and Astronomy Institute in Australia. Dr. Moss is the head of the science operation for the ASCAP telescope in Western Australia, and she has studied cosmic phenomena across the universe, many different topics. But Vanessa also leads the Future of Meetings community to explore and disseminate new ways of meeting and collaborating. The thing is, it has been clear that standard science practices, science meeting practices, have created a normal that we take for granted, but that is actually exclusive and not sustainable. In today's talk, Dr. Vanessa will therefore talk about going beyond this old normal for a sustainable future in science. Vanessa, the floor is yours. Don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, all good. Can you hear me okay? Well, firstly, thank you, David, for the invite to speak to you all, and really looking forward to the conversation and also to, I guess, finding out more, hopefully after, about what kind of questions people have and the kind of experiences in this topic everyone's having. Because one of the most exciting things about the work we've been doing is connecting with different communities around the world who are all asking the same questions and trying to figure out what the best path forward is. So thank you for the introduction. So like David said, I am based at CSIRO in Australia in space and astronomy. So CSIRO is Australia's national science agency. And we work in a lot of different areas. And I think actually there's probably some interesting space weather stuff. So I have a space weather slide later. But the main topic of this talk is, looking at going beyond the old normal and what we used to take for granted as this is just how things are done, and thinking about how we can have a more sustainable future for the ways that we do science and basically everything. It's not even just limited to science, it's just the way we interact and work. I'd like to start by an acknowledgement of country. So Australia, like many countries, has a long and convoluted history, and I think there are steps to try and do better. One of the things we often do is try to reflect on the place that we are located. So I'm giving this talk today from my home, which is in Darug country. It's actually a really wide country that takes up a lot of Western Sydney. And one of the Australia is actually divided into like 100. I don't know exactly how many numbers, but it's a lot of different countries across. And so anyway, but the work that I do, the people that I connect with, I work in a very distributed team. And so these are some of the other countries that my collaborators and my team that I work with in ASCAP are from. So I'd like to start with that acknowledgement of country and pay respect to elders, past and present. And I really hope that we are heading towards a better future for the way that we acknowledge Indigenous cultures and make things better in Australia. But yes, it's a work in progress. So a brief introduction. So I've been based at CSIRO since 2019. Before that, I was at Astron, which is in the Netherlands. Similar to CSIRO in many ways. Astron is the Netherlands Institute for Radio Astronomy and is part of a bigger collection of different science institutes. That was really fun. I really enjoyed living there. And then before that, I was at the University of Sydney for a long time doing a lot of like postdoc and undergrad and honors studies. As well as ASCAP science operations, I have a number of different roles. So one is, and I'm sure this is actually interesting to find out about the synergies in space weather, but we have a project looking at how collaborative intelligence can apply in astronomy context, specifically for ASCAP, which is the telescope I work with the most. And so this is looking at applications of ML and AI, and specifically how humans and AI can collaborate together. So not just replacing the humans, but having this collaborative connection with the tools that we use. And I lead the Future of Meetings, and I'm currently also a member of the EMCR Forum, which is the Early and Mid-Career Researcher Forum. That's part of the Australian Academy of Science. So one of the things I also do a fair bit of thinking about is how to make academia more sustainable for early career researchers that are coming through. So all of these things sort of have various links to TFOM, even though they're different roles. the overview of this talk. So this is a brief, I guess, introduction to what I'll cover. So looking back, it actually seems pretty far away now at 2020 and the old normal. And then how TFOM came to be and sort of some of the things we've learned and where we've got to with with TFOM. And yeah, one of the really interesting concepts I think that we'll come back to a couple of times is going beyond being there. This is actually taken from a paper that was written in 1992 that really all of the conversations we were having in 2020 about the future of meetings and how hard it is and what the challenges are, a lot of these were covered in 92, even before the technology was the way it is now. So these are not new challenges, but we are in a different place now to hopefully get new solutions to them. So looking back at 2020, I was in Australia at the start of 2020. So the thing we thought was actually going to be the apocalypse of the year was fire. We had a very bad fire season, one of the worst like ever recently. Like there's been a lot of bad fire seasons, but this was really bad. Like so much of Australia was on fire, and I remember giving a talk in February, which was about why science is important to society, and yeah, it was. I didn't. Some people I knew saw the pandemic coming, but I thought fire was going to be the biggest thing we faced that year. And I can fully admit that I was, and still am in a lot of ways, part of the problem back then, because the very last thing I did before COVID lockdown was I was in Perth for a collaboration visit. I think one thing that had evolved already was trying to combine a lot of different things. At least I was never the kind of person who would travel for one day and then come back. Like it has to be super important, I think, to do that. But even so, I think there was just not a lot of questioning of, can we do things differently? As much like we were starting to have conversations about it, but most people generally in astronomy accepted this is just how things are done. And so that year there was a lot of other travel on the agenda. Again, I think none of these conferences really had any accommodations planned for online. It was all just going to be in person. So yeah, like that was the plan. And at the time, I felt kind of bad about it, but you also didn't feel like there was anything you could do. It was sort of like, this is just how academia works. And the thing I think we've come to reflect on as part of the future of meetings is that, super interestingly, the format of how we meet, especially conferences, hasn't evolved that much over the last century. We look back to the Solvay conference in 1911, or for us in astronomy, the first gathering of the International Astronomical Union. And then we compare it to what we see more recently now, like the IAU General Assembly 2006, ADAS 2019, which I was at. Like it is big gatherings of people, often in big conference centers. But the program, the way we meet, like there hasn't been a lot of evolution. Whereas we've been collaborating with some historians that are studying the evolution of the scientific conference. We haven't actually checked in with them for a while. We should check in, but they're doing such interesting things, like looking at how conferences themselves, the formats evolved over the 20th century. And the early 20th century, my understanding is that there was quite a big shift because we suddenly had more open conferences. The rise of the diplomatic conference was a big thing. And before, like these meetings had been more closed, less, I guess, democratically accessible. So that is a good thing. But since then, not so much changed, despite how much else has changed in the meantime. So we're definitely overdue to rethink the reasons we gather and whether we can do them in a better way. And so, yeah, so anyway, so I think this is something that a lot of academics who travel think about now is like, and I actually, from what I understand, a lot of people do make these choices. Like if they have the choice, they try to say, all right, well, is me going in person, is this the right thing, or can I? And reducing is a huge part of this, of changing our kind of practices. I at one point had to gather my travel for between 2010 and 2020. I probably should dig up the data and figure out a better way to plot it. But what it is every point in the line is like representing, I think, the midpoint of a trip that was overseas, and how many hours I spent. So I think the main thing that's clear. So when I was a student, the trips were very sporadic because there was no funding. I think this is mostly work travel. I'm trying to remember if I separated it all out, but long trips and quite sporadic. As I became a postdoc, there were shorter trips and more frequent. And once I became kind of like a senior postdoc and staff, it was suddenly, like there was a lot more travel. So I think this is very typical. We know from studies that have collected data, for example, there's a Stevens et al. Paper from it's 2020, and maybe it's 2019, and it looks at kind of the distribution of emissions in one institute in Australia. And it was found that, yeah, most of those emissions are coming from senior people, not from students. So there is an unequal distribution of who's producing the emissions and the way we travel. Yeah, but again, this is was seen as part of a normal academic career progression. So like I said, Sydney in February 2020 was pretty apocalyptic. You got a lot of really nice photos of bushfire smoke, inhaled a lot of smoke, and this was everywhere. Like, I mean, this was one of the times where I think the fires were just kind of all over, just the mountains and the coast and south and rural. There's just a lot of fires, and I think there's possibly, yeah, I mean, we'll see how this year goes, but I think now that we're coming out of La Nina, we're looking at possibly this coming back again and just getting worse every year. So maybe another way of calling my talk would be why we can't or should not go back to normal, because I mean, we also have seen floods. I didn't talk about the floods or the dead fish, but yeah, so there's a lot of reasons, like there's a lot of ways I think in which we're seeing the changes. It's not some theoretical thing. It's not something that's going to happen in 5 years. We're literally the frogs in the pot boiling now, and we're starting to get the splashes from it. So I think it's a good time to revisit how we can adapt and what are the things we can start to do. Because there's a huge question about, is the old normal the right normal? You know, is it the best way we can do things? There are definitely some good things about it, but maybe we can do other things that are just as effective. And I think I don't know about the space weather community, but we in astronomy, there's a lot of thinking about the sustainable development goals. We have as part of the IAU, we have the Office for Astronomy for Development, which is really about looking at how all of the activities in astronomy can contribute to these different goals. And some of them are harder than others, but some of them are actually really, really good ways to frame the work we do and think about its impact and try to make it positive. So that's something we, I guess, in astronomy are starting to think about a little. Another big question that was sort of leading up to what we did in TFOM was what happens when you're not in the room. Even before COVID, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of hybrid and like online meetings for our work. And there are a lot of ways in which I think small changes, like so having maybe not everyone else in a room and one person online, but trying to distribute it more, actually made the meeting a lot better for everyone. So yeah, so I think that fly on the wall and being out of the conversation, it's an experience a lot of people have. Technology and just the way we design meetings can help us get around that if we approach them differently. So yeah, so can we also be together with people when we're apart? One of the biggest, I guess, arguments or things in favor of in-person interaction is that sort of social interaction, that value you get from being around other people, which is really, like, it's true, it's really nice. But there is also perhaps a misconception that you cannot have these sort of things online because most people's experiences are limited to things like video calls. So one of the things, yeah, we were trying to explore was what are the ways we can do this? What are the kind of technologies that are out there that make this as easy as possible? And so another aspect is, as you know, there's no denying that there was a huge amount of badness and negative outcomes from COVID. You know, everyone I think probably was personally affected in some ways, many serious ways. And so I think the question is, well, can we get some good out of this? What are the things that it reset, or the things that it accelerated, and how can we maximize that good going forward so that we both move on from the worst parts of COVID, but also, you know, take some of the good things and make our daily practices better. So the Future of Meetings was a symposium that we brought together under all those sort of questions and themes in 2020. You could validly ask the question, why were astronomers so core in leading it? We did build an organizing committee that was distributed across the different sciences of CSIRO. But I think, yeah, I guess it was just, we were the first ones to propose it, but it would have happened eventually. Like there were so many people. Like the coolest thing about the symposium was that it was truly relevant to everyone. We could bring in so many different perspectives that were all really valuable, and it was very cross-disciplinary because, you know, there were different insights from different fields. So yeah, so that, and I think astronomy itself is quite a, I guess, maybe we like technology a lot in astronomy, so we tend to embrace technology quickly, but we're also very distributed. The way we work, like it's almost always international collaborations from start. Anyway, so with the Future of Meeting Symposium, we held the symposium, which was really great. We had a lot of really interesting, I guess, content discussions, people attending, and we also were using it as a way to experiment on ourselves. So, which sounds darker than it was, but it was approaching the meeting and the design of the meeting from the perspective of how do we learn as much as possible, and then how do we share that with others so that hopefully they can learn from what we learned, and hope, and especially the kind of challenges we faced or the good things that came out of it. So we wrote a report very like in the couple of months after. We actually published it in December 2020 because we decided like it's going to be a good thing that comes out of 2020. So we made sure we finished it in December. That's online, that's on Zenodo. We can circulate the links to that to people after, and possibly the slides as well. We tried to also condense what we'd learned into, well, I guess it's like 8 key themes. This was and there's a lot, there's the sort of infographic style, and there's more detail that I'll go into in the following slides. But the idea was that if when designing or thinking about how you approached a meeting, which could be a conference or a workshop, or it could just be like a regular meeting that you have, if you thought about these at least, or sort of were able to justify the choices you made under this umbrella, then that would help you have, like kind of structure it in a good way. So that was the intent with these. I'll go briefly. So there's a lot of text on here, but this is all taken from the report, so you can go to that. But the idea is just to give a bit more insight into what we meant when we came up with these different things, and formed it into DICERV. So the first one, and one of the most important ones for us, was digital first, which was, I guess, we saw a lot of things where it was really, especially in hybrid, for example, it's in person. You start with the in person, then you tack on the online. But digital first was trying to flip that and say, all right, well, actually, assume there's a digital central point, like which could be a Zoom meeting, or it could be a conference platform, and everything else connects to that. So yeah, rather than trying to just tag on the online, you start digital first. And that actually helps a lot also with dealing with issues. So rather than saying, okay, well, we're having a meeting in this auditorium and that's defining the solution, actually the digital venue is defining the solution, which could be Zoom and Vimeo and all of that. And the venue, the auditorium, connects to that. So, and just also thinking about digital first, like having those digital mechanisms to connect audiences. So I think this is especially relevant for hybrid, as well, as well as all other forms. These were the accessibility, inclusivity, and sustainability were 3 key themes that when we built the Future of Meetings program, we brought them together, and those have sort of stayed active, I guess, in our minds. So accessibility being making sure the content is as accessible as possible to people, inclusivity about having people be able to attend and take part, and then obviously sustainability, which is the key focus of the chat we're having today. How can we minimize the environmental damage that we do as part of our meetings? And these, so there's a lot of tips we had. I should say the report is very thorough. It's 88 pages. So if you're looking for a good read, you can definitely check that out. Experimentation. This is one of the interesting ones that I felt like has always surprised me sometimes, that we have like in my community, that I have to convince scientists to be experimental. There's this kind of fear of trying something new and having it go wrong, but actually that's the way we learn. And we don't, if something doesn't work, you just change it again. So I think that it has a lot of parallels also in leadership, or like this growth mindset that people talk about for career progression. There's a lot of overlap there, but basically it's just saying, experiment, try things, and don't be afraid to fail, which I think is, nothing has to last forever if you try a new tool or something. So so experimentation was really important. Right tool approach is an interesting one because we've seen a lot of people get scared of, say, too many tools, which is true. You don't want to have like 10 platforms that you're expecting people to all use. So we felt choosing the right tool for the particular problem as well as a lot of people, if you say online meeting, their only thought is video call because they haven't had other experiences of other platforms. So I think there's a sort of like a sweet spot between a few platforms that do the thing that they need to do quite well and they meet the goals of the interaction. So not too many, but not just one tool to solve them all, which we've seen, like there are certain tools and platforms out there that try to do everything. It's very hard to do everything well. And so they end up kind of falling short of even delivering some of the basic stuff they need to do. Value is probably a trickier one to explain. And what it really came down to is that, well, I mean, it made a nice acronym, DICERV, but like value is really, you know, things cost money. They shouldn't necessarily cost zero to be good. Some people have a misconception that if you go online, it doesn't cost anything. And that's true. It doesn't have to cost anything, but it sometimes, if you want to do something well, it can cost something, and that's okay because in-person costs a lot. So this value is about where we have limited funds and resources, choosing where to invest them wisely and making sure that they, you know, that it's worth it. So is it worth paying $100,000 for a really fancy conference platform, or can you get away with a mix of different tools, or a less expensive one, or one where you do more yourself as an organizer? So those sort of decisions is just, I guess, yeah, justifying wherever they're like, and also recognizing the value that experts or people around you can bring and help out with. And then evaluation, which is something honestly, I think in TFOM, we probably need to do better ourselves. So evaluating, actually, one of the things we learned as part of TFOM was that evaluation kind of starts before the thing that you're doing even happens. So thinking about what success looks like, what are the outcomes, that sort of stuff, which all sort of sometimes seems basic, but accountability, like I feel like with grants and all kinds of things, the things we promise in proposals, like no one ever comes back later and says, did you deliver them? So obviously more of that accountability of like, just, yeah, everywhere, especially with meetings. We've seen a lot where people say, oh, well, you know, in-person meetings, they're great, but have we actually stepped back and properly quantified or even qualified what that greatness is? Can we go beyond just saying serendipitous chats in the hallway or meeting new people randomly? Like, can we actually try to measure it? So I think evaluation is somewhere where there's a lot of improvement that could be made. So after all that, after the Future Meeting Symposium, we stayed active, or a subset of the organizing committee plus other interested people that we met through the symposium formed a community of practice with the goal of continuing to do what we could to advance, I guess, uptake of online interaction and hybrid stuff in the community. And share stuff that we found out from TFOM as well. So we've provided advice on execution for and actually doing like helping run certain conferences where it made sense to just really, I guess, make as much difference as possible so that people could have good online experiences and we could try to capture them and learn from them and share them with others as well. And we do ongoing experiments with technology to try and find the ways in which this technology can be brought into academia better. So like, what are the most effective ways that we can use particular platforms or particular types of emerging technology? And all of this is because I say community practice because everyone has a proper day job. So this is really all happening like kind of in the small amounts of time that we can put together. So we have to sort of be a bit choosy about where we invest our effort because it's pretty limited at the moment. So DICERV in the astronomy case, and I mean, you could go through the same sort of process of thinking about where it applies, and maybe it's very similar in space weather. But for us, one of it is with digital first, it's how do we actually, we've always had quite a distributed astronomy, but there's also certain things people have always had to be in person because reasons. And so I think there's a good chance here to step back and say, all right, well, can we change the ways we do astronomy locally, but also across a country and in the global context? And accessibility and inclusivity is a huge topic in astronomy. It's somewhere where I think everyone is trying to do better and acknowledging there's a big gap there. One of the conferences we helped to run was the International Conference for Women in Physics. We were involved in the technical side of that. And it really just showed to me how many countries I've never actually seen at any astronomy conference I've ever been to. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There are things like visas, there's funding, there's all the reasons people can't travel. But it was real, like, I met people in countries I didn't even really know that there were astronomers or physicists there, because they're not able to be at a lot of the standard meetings you would otherwise go to. So yeah, our scientific workflows can definitely change and improve to be more inclusive. With astronomy, we're trying to characterize our carbon footprint, so measure. There's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of papers and articles about what exactly our carbon footprint is now for institutes. Our facilities are a big contributor to the carbon footprint. Supercomputing is another one, but that one is getting better with more renewable energy sources. So both measuring, but also trying to change it. And one of the things I've seen in the sustainability discussion, like as in, as institutes try to move on to be more sustainable too, is that it's often, yes, people could bicycle to work sometimes more, or there's those sort of things, but there's not enough consideration of how important it is that we have things like work from home, flexible work, which means people don't have to commute as much, which means you remove a huge amount of commuter traffic. That's a big carbon savings, as well as the expectations of how we do our job and how much we should or need to travel. So anyway, so I think there's a lot that can be done there. The right tools, trying to prepare astronomy and other fields for the future as technologies come. We always have a limited funds problem. I think that's true probably everywhere. So how do we best distribute that to get the most value out of it? And then evaluation again. So I guess it's worth pointing out, like I said, I am speaking from a position of authority when it comes to in-person, because it's something I know pretty well. And there are, these are the sort of things in astronomy that we would do, probably similar in other academia. So things like collaboration visits for different lengths of time, unconferences, which I think I was always impressed by the unconference model, because it was really saying, well, I mean, I guess maybe that is one way that conferences have evolved, but not many people do it. It's still very traditional structures overall. This particular unconference was a month-long thing where people would spend at least, I think you're expected to spend 2 weeks. It doesn't have to be 2 consecutive weeks, but yeah, and it's more unstructured, less talks, more about collaboration, which I think is pretty cool. Schools, so training and education of people, things like observing, which are actually becoming increasingly remote, and I'll come back to that, and conferences, of course. So one of the things we tried to do with TFOM, and I think it'd be interesting to hear from people about if you can think of other things, or if you agree or disagree with these sort of lists, we tried to think about what is the valuable thing that you can do in person? What is the stuff that is either harder to do online, or just, it's a good justification of in person? So things like social events, difficult conversations. We've actually debated either way on that, because sometimes difficult conversations can actually be easier online. Although, I mean, depends, because someone could always hang up. So maybe that's harder. I guess you can walk away too in person. Catch ups, sharing ideas. So this hallway conversation idea, we've talked about how so far we haven't really seen technology do a great job of reproducing random interactions or serendipity. And that's something I think it can do. We just haven't got the right way yet. If the work requires it, obviously not everyone has a choice about being in person. Sometimes our engineers in CSIRO, they don't always have to be in the lab, but sometimes they do if they're building hardware or they're testing it in some way. That is evolving too, because I think labs themselves are becoming more automated and remote. But there is work that still requires in person. Building personal networks, one of the things that came out of COVID was that it was much harder for new people to integrate into an institution or to get to know people. If you already had that social credit, if you knew people, then it was easier for teams to keep functioning. But I don't know, it was a lot harder for people who are new. And I can see that for sure. Like, I know most of the people at CSIRO, but if I had started and didn't know anyone, like I've known them, like I've been there for a long time, or just collaborating for a long time, if I didn't know anyone, it would be quite hard with the standard meetings that we have or the standard interactions that we have to get to know them. So I think that's somewhere where we can definitely do better online, but it can be good in person too. And long-term collaboration, the things where you actually immerse yourself in a culture or an institution or something, and you're staying there for a really long time. There's a lot of value in that. So that's not to say like so these are sort of things, I guess the point of this is, if we're designing things that we think should be in person, can we maximize these things that give the most value from it, rather than, for example, bringing people together for a week to mostly sit in a room and watch passive content for like 80% of the time. So if I look back, I went to a lot of conferences and workshops. Most of them I can't remember, which I think is a sign that there's too many, but these are some of the key ones that did have a big impact on my career. And I think this would be a useful exercise for people listening or watching to do. Think about the ones that actually made a big difference and why. The radio school in 2010, that was the thing I did when I first started honors. I met a lot of people there, peers, as well as senior people who were giving talks, who I've stayed connected with over the years. And also a lot of those students are still in astronomy in different places. So that was a really, I guess, first foundational network thing that helped a lot with getting to know people. Don't really remember much of the interferometry I was supposed to be taught at that time, but I definitely got a lot out of the meeting people part. Dot astronomy, so this is, I think they're up to 12 now. So this is a conference that brings together people from across different parts of astronomy who are interested in technology, web applications, sort of like tech stuff, technical things. And, it had some talks, but it was always a lot about unconferencing and discussions and hack days. So it was really flipping that conference model. And that was a place, I think, where I started to figure out that I really did like the technology side and how that can make astronomy better. So I think that was quite a big one. And then RFI 2016 plus, I was invited to give a talk kind of covering all the ways in which RFI affects astronomy, which was really fun to put together because I had to talk to all my friends that were like doing different kinds of radio astronomy in the RFI. But also it was a really good chance to connect with a broader community, the engineering side, and so all of these things have shaped the career path that I took. But a lot of conferences didn't have that much impact. Another argument people often make is about the cost for EMCRs. So if we think about the future researchers, the junior ones, I think it's absolutely true. We do have to make sure that the future generations of scientists have opportunities to build their careers and make sure that things don't come at a cost for that. But the argument I'm not so sure I agree with, that is, which people don't exactly say, but it's sort of said without saying, is if they don't do things exactly the way we did it, then they won't turn out like us. There's a couple of things wrong with that. Was firstly, the context that most senior academics have come up through is very different to now. And so, there are different challenges. And I think actually it's best if we prepare the junior researchers for how can they use the way that the world is now to their advantage in a good way. So prepare them for, because things aren't going to stay in person forever. It is going to evolve. Stuff is going to change. The world's going to change a lot. So we should do as much as we can to make sure they won't turn out like us, or at least not the bad, the good parts of us. Sure. One thing to mention, I think this is, we definitely need more data. I'd love to have more data on this, but the data on the left for everyone probably, is showing Human Development Index on the bottom, which is sort of a measure of how much wealth a country has, its development, its growth. It's a sort of step in for I guess GDP. And the number, so one of the studies I was involved with analyzed the conference attendance for all conferences in 2019, which were basically all in person. And so the dots represent the number of conference attendees normalized by the population and color-coded by the total carbon emissions estimated. What you see is with Human Development Index, there's a huge, quite strong correlation. This is the y-axis is log in how many people from countries with high HDIs appear at conferences, how much carbon they're emitting versus the low HDI. If we go online, like I said, we need more data, but you can start to normalize this because in a lot of ways, it is easier to connect online, even when there are challenges of infrastructure like power and internet. You can connect online easier than you can solve visa problems, which are completely out of your control and out of organizers' control. And you can, what else? Funding, right? So you can fund and invest in infrastructure that lasts a lot longer versus one single trip, which doesn't. So I really want to see more data on this, but I think it's sort of quantifying what we already know, which is that if you go online, you can include a lot more people. So what's wrong with the current situation? This is just one of those slides I'll show quickly, but I think the point of it is that there are a lot of problems with what we see online and the things we see in hybrid as well. But actually what we've seen in TFOM from the work we've done is there are a lot of, not always easy, but sometimes straightforward solutions. There are always ways to mitigate them. There are things you can do. And this is something that as a global community, we're still learning, because we've had many years of in-person interaction to try and get that right. But technology is much newer. Using online meetings is a lot newer. The internet is newer. So it's not entirely surprising. We're still figuring out how to do it, but it doesn't mean it's not solvable. It just means it takes more effort. So some of the small things, you know, this is from 2 different colloquia. One had good lighting, one had bad lighting, and you can see easily the difference that good lighting makes. But it doesn't have to be super expensive. Like, I'm trying to remember, I think this was literally like a desk lamp that was pointed. Anyway, so it doesn't have to be a super all singing or dancing AV setup to be effective. It can be quite a low budget one. There are technologies out there that sort of help with this. One of the ones we've experimented with is the meeting owl, which I named TFOL, and I'm still proud of that name. But what this does, it's expensive for what it is, and I think there'll be competitors, but it's a fisheye lens. Maybe people have seen it. And it automatically, like with software, zooms into people as they speak, as well as giving a panoramic overview. So for small meetings, especially around round tables, things like that, it's a really effective way of giving people more insight into the room. The other thing we've seen since then is that a lot of conference meeting setups are incorporating this kind of technology as well. Another point is online formats can definitely go beyond video calls. And I hope everyone here has experienced some of the other ways beyond video calls. But if you haven't, we have a lot of ideas that we can suggest and platforms we can recommend if you want to try something different. Gather has been one that I think has been very popular. There are a lot of things like it. And it's a really simple concept. You know, you just take away the fact that in Zoom, you can't walk away from people, but otherwise it's, you know, it's a spatial autonomy addition to a video call. But we've also done a lot of work with recently with mixed reality, because that seems to be, I think, one of the technologies that is accelerating very quickly and is getting quite a critical mass, but is very underused in academia and in research and stuff like that. And when it is used, it's often kind of borderline a little like gimmicky. But what we've seen is there are really useful and really interesting ways to apply it that are quite cool. So SNA in the context, when we think about, I wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of operation stuff and things we see with the telescopes. The future of meetings is relevant for us because our teams are already distributed. We have like, at least as well as people at observatories, we have people concentrated on both halves of Australia, so East and West Coast. We're seeing a lot of rise of things like remote management of telescopes, remote observing. Supercomputing is a big question because there's a lot more of this emphasis on, rather than like, we tend to want to download the data and deal with it on our computers, but there's a lot more bringing the code. So having distributed research practices and workflows, like you don't actually ever see the data, you just work on it remotely. So there's a lot of ways I think in which the same things that we're thinking about for TFOM are applying to our daily work, and maybe to yours as well. I wrote this was a really fun proceeding to write. This was for the ADAS meeting in 2019, where I was asked to give a talk on, what did I contribute? I can't remember. Time has passed. But anyway, I got to write a proceeding on basically my opinions about how observatories will evolve. And I, discussed with a lot of people, and I've worked with a lot of different telescopes, and this is sort of what I came up with. And so these are sort of the big things that we'd seen that were really important. So it was to do with people and the role of people and having that technical expertise, automation. I love automation. I do like collaborative intelligence because I think realistically you cannot completely automate your entire workflow. Like there is a really important role for the human expert, and it's good to think about it. But I do also just love how much automation has been able to make my life easier. Communication, ongoing challenge for every institute ever. The big picture, sort of balancing that with the details. I think that's been a big challenge for us with things like ASCAP, where there are a lot of details and it's easy to kind of lose track of the bigger picture. And then testing, I think testing is important, but we've seen so much, you learn a lot if you can get on Sky as quickly as possible. So that was really important. So with ASCAP and with also Apatief, which is the telescope I worked with in the Netherlands, there's been, we the old kind of way of observing is quite manual. Most observatories now do have a significant degree of automation that helps make people's lives easier. Things like codes that generate schedules, or things, you fill a schedule and it automatically completes. With ASCAP, we've really been pushing as much as possible towards what we describe as autonomous scheduling. It's not just automated where a human says do these things and leaves it, but we actually build the system so that they can make the decisions. Not necessarily like in an AI, like, I can't do that, Dave sort of way, but more like we teach, well, not teach even, because it's not necessarily learning, but we set it up so it has access to the same sort of contextual information that a human would have in making a decision, and then it uses that to make that decision. But it's usually deterministic and systematic because we don't want different decisions each time. There's a lot of work as well that we have as part of Syntel in looking at automating how we look at, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of raw data, there's a lot of images. There is a lot of work already looking at this for science data. We're focusing more on how do we use this data to, I guess, bring out the hardware issues and alert us sooner. So that we can, I guess, deal with the problems more quickly. And so what we've seen with this automation, as well as I think an important factor in this that's not always thought about, is how much more effective we are because we're a distributed team, because we don't rely on people all having to be in one physical place at the same time. The communications is easier because that's also in a centralized digital first format. So that means, everything's just a lot more efficient. So this is sort of the way we've seen with the combination of that distributed element, as well as more automation and more robustness over time. When we first observed the phase 1 surveys, there were a lot of failures and a lot of things that we had to improve on. And when we went into Sauron, this was the first test of the autonomous scheduling. And then this was like a little bit after that, and it goes on after this as well. But that has been super effective for improving our efficiency. And I'm hopeful that we will apply these sort of autonomy workflows throughout the whole system and improve everything. I did promise I wanted to mention a little bit of space weather. So that ability to build remote autonomous operations as part of our standard workflows means that we can potentially react quite quickly to transient events, or do things like regular monitoring without needing to, I guess, human intervene all the time. There's a huge growing interest in, I know there's already a space weather community in Australia, but within CSIRO as well, there's a lot more interest in it. We've seen the sun is getting more and more active. I had a friend who was doing a PhD on the last solar maximum, which I think was quite underwhelming. This one is overwhelming. We already see a lot of data issues in ASCAP because of it, and I think we're still figuring out how best we deal with that. Because so there's the red here, or the really, really bright wiggly stuff is the sun when it's super active, but mostly it's supposed to look more like that. And we have one group so far, but I think the interest in space weather will probably grow, working on solar wind passing in front of radio sources, and then we can get the twinkling that can tell us something about the compactness of the radio source, as well as the physical properties of the solar wind. So we're in the operations side, which is where I sit, looking at how we can take these various space weather interests, and it would be interesting to hear, I guess, if this community is also keen to look at this and see how we can turn space weather monitoring into something that's an ongoing, and even if small, but some part of what ASCAP's doing. And radio images of the sun. So the image on the left, this is an image made by Emil, who's our guru image maker. But this was matching it to, I couldn't find which solar image this was. Maybe someone recognizes it, but showing that there was some correlation in the patterns. So these questions, the same way the TFOM stuff that I do is applicable to so much other stuff in my work, alongside AI as well. We are thinking, what does it even mean to operate a telescope? It used to look super cool, you'd sit in front of these fancy machines and I guess look very important because there's so many buttons. And then it became screens, which I think are less cool and probably harder to see. I don't know. But it's it's very much, oh, it was this and now it's this. But I think the future could be quite different, especially in the context of the collaborative intelligence side. The other challenge we're facing and we're thinking about is training the next generation. We used to train them on site. People stopped going to site because there was remote observing. In 2019, it was still very much in person, which I think varied wildly, you know, in how effective it can be because not everyone can see the thing. In 2020, obviously, we were forced by default to go online. I mean, I think it's bad we weren't doing it sooner, but, you know, this is an example of a group online in 2020. But I'm hopeful that, yeah, we can, again, use technology and use this distributed sort of form of interaction to make much better experiences than we had before. We also in astronomy are seeing that there's a rise of the mega facility where it's not really one institute that's operating a facility anymore, but it's a giant conglomeration of lots of institutes, lots of momentum in certain directions, very distributed people. And I don't think we really have the solution for that yet, because so many people are still used to coming from like a one institute where maybe they went into the office a lot of the time. And I think this is going to change a lot of that. In the future of meetings, like I said, we've worked a little bit in mixed reality. We ran a session at the SIGGRAPH BOF, I think it was 2021, talking about extended reality. This was with people who are the people developing those sort of technologies. So extended is just like XR, and that sort of lumps together virtual, augmented, and mixed reality. The reason I show this is because I think it's kind of interesting. We asked them if it had been in person, which was planned. This one was completely online. Would you have been there? And we found an overwhelming majority was probably not. So there were a lot more people that had access to this meeting because it was online. So I think this already is a huge reason why, even if we keep in-person things, we have to do some stuff online only. It's not enough to just go hybrid because you don't get the same experience if you're online at an in-person first meeting. We asked them, when is XR going to stop being a gimmick and be truly useful? I was actually surprised because I found the community closest to a technology is often the most critical, but most people thought within 2 to 5 years. So we are now in 2023, this was 2021. So we're in that window. So hopefully in the next year or so, next couple of years, we really are going to see, I think we're already seeing a lot of it. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Apple Vision later this year. But yeah, so I think now is a really good time for people to be learning about mixed reality and trying it out and experimenting with it if you can. We also asked about working from home in the office, and we found there were very few people who wanted office only, but for most people it depended. It was a flexibility thing. There were a lot of people who preferred the home, but otherwise it was a mix or it depended. So flexibility was one of the key things we saw. And one of the I guess companies we had as part of TFOM that was WeWork, and I think definitely these co-working spaces and shared offices and stuff where they try to make it fun and cool. I don't know how actual functional they are. Sometimes they're very pretty, but I don't know how easy it would be to do actual work. But it seems like we do need to rethink the role of the office as well. If we want people to go to the office, what value does it provide them that they can't get at home? What is the reason for doing it? So I'll quickly read this. This is an extract from a perspective I wrote for the EMCR Forum newsletter, which was sort of kind of trying to give a vision of what it could be like. And not even this is not that far from now, right? So anyway, so what it says is it's 11 a.m. in your time zone. You're about to drop into the office of a colleague on the West Coast to check on a project you're working on together using data from a lab in Japan. Earlier that morning, you assessed the results of your experiments, which had run autonomously overnight, and conversed quickly with the AI to adjust some parameters for the next 24 hours. At lunchtime, your research team is getting together for the quarterly virtual cross-country lunch, and today's theme is local produce, with a small recipe box having turned up on your doorstep 2 days ago. Later that day, you'll grab coffee with a coworker in the Netherlands, the late afternoon sun for you, almost seamlessly blending with the morning sun for them. Your last meeting of the day is with your student from South Africa who sent you an excited message last night about the results from their latest simulation, and you'll be meeting in virtual reality to examine the model in 3D, joined by the student's Brazil-based co-supervisor. When I wrote this, the idea was this is almost possible now. It's not that far in the future, even though it sounds a little bit futuristic. This is where I think we're probably, hopefully heading if we can accept that, we can actually collaborate worldwide and technology allows us to do this. And so I showed that picture before of, all the different astronomy interactions that I'd had, conferences and schools and stuff. I've had so many interesting and cool and fun experiences online over the last few years that I'm already convinced that no, we don't have to give up on in-person. We can still do it, but there are so many cool things we can do online that we could not do in person. And for that alone, that convinces me that there's so much opportunity there. So one of the things we're doing in TFOM now, or with the experiment we've just been running, was we worked with CSIRO to design and build a kind of virtual reality exhibit museum that showcases ASCAP technology and the science and some of the engineering as well. So we built that as part of TFOM in collaboration with CSIRO, using real CAD models and images and stuff like that. And then we took it to 3 in-person conferences. So we're currently writing that up and putting it together. But the reason we did that was really to expose, like to, I guess, give people access to this technology and this information in a really new, interesting way, but also show that VR can be used in different ways and expose a whole new community that might not even know that virtual reality is as easy as it is now. So that's something that we are currently working on. We also, so these are sort of our most active things right now. The mixed reality side, so experimenting with that, trying new platforms. We have a number of cases where we're either running or designing meetings that will be mostly online or hybrid, and then looking at how we can change up the structure of that. So that's one of the, I guess, things we're also doing. And we're part of the International Astronomical Union General Assembly organization, providing advice on how they can do hybrid and virtual. It's going to be in South Africa, which I think is great because this is the first time in the history of the IAU that it has ever gone to South Africa, or to the African continent. It's never been there. So that's cool. And it should definitely go, like it should be in person. But what we're trying to do is, I guess, make sure that the hybrid offering is as inclusive as possible, because not everyone will be able to go. And I mentioned beyond being there at the start, this is a quote from the paper I mentioned. I really recommend going to check that out. You can find it online. But it's, in our view of the future, it is not so much distance that will be abolished, but rather our current concept of being there, because they argued that so many problems with the ways we build technology or the things we expect it to do come from the belief that we need it to just reproduce in person. But the best technological advances, the things we've seen technology change the most over the last few decades, is the things it does that we just couldn't do in person, like messaging, chat messaging and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of other examples, but anyway, so I think that's a really cool thing and something we think about a lot in TFOM. So what are the steps that people can do? What are the things we can start to change today already? I think even just questioning whether something needs to be in person is a start, making sure that, you know, whatever you do is as accessible as possible, and just limiting some of the things, the in-person activities that we organize or that we attend, to the things that we think are going to have the most value or be the most useful. Tomorrow, I think it's really about these conversations, these sort of things about how can we do better in the future, connecting with different communities like today. That's a huge part, because there's so many different experiences and ideas and approaches that are being invented within these different groups. And yeah, like it's good to have all of these and also have ways to share between them. So I think combining with that global effort, advocating digital first, there's a lot of ways to call it. Sometimes people call it online first. But anyway, yeah, so just, I think, flipping the thinking about how we design, especially the big meetings and conferences, and designing better hybrid approaches as well. New practices and being experimental. Like I said, experimentation is really important. Yeah, and we, you know, if you do have a look closely at DISERV, it'd be good to hear feedback or thoughts that people might have about that. For the longer term, it's clear that our funding structures are very much designed for a different world. And so I think things like grants, for example, sometimes you're starting to be asked now what's the sustainability impact of a project you're proposing. But we see, for example, it's very hard to repurpose things like funding for travel to things that help people travel digitally. Like, instead of having your flight paid for, could you have a VR headset bought for you? Or things that will make people's work from home setups easier. So I think funding structures, both in institutes and more broadly, need to adapt. Mixed reality will hopefully come in on that 2 to 5 year timescale, or maybe it's like 1 to 3 years now. With the EMCR thing in mind, I think it is really important in a sustainability context to think about the sustainability of future careers. So how we can make sure that the astronomers or scientists or people of the future can inherit a way of working that is going to, I guess, work in the world as it changes as well. And for us in astronomy, it's very much about, and this is science as well, but just global astronomy. So we want to design collaborations that are more location agnostic. Do people need to move around the world just for a postdoc of 2 years? I mean, there's a lot of value from being immersed in a new context, but there's a lot of disruption and negative damage that it does to people too. So I think there are ways we can explore different ways of adopting that model. So our recommendations are to consider the role of DICERF or other models like that in terms of planning your meetings. Try to include as much as possible. When using in person, use it wisely. The future of work is definitely coming here. So I think preparation, so it's not surprising, is as good as possible. Trying to make sure location doesn't matter unless it really does have to. In the automation context is minimizing human dependency. So where do we actually need human effort? And mixed reality, we think, is really gonna grow quite a lot. So one of the quotes I wanted to end with is, I asked a question about, so this was a meeting I wouldn't have been able to go to in person because it's too far from my field, but because we were collaborating with SIGGRAPH anyway, we were sort of involved. And they were talking about how with this movie, they had collaborations around the world. So I asked, how did you do this? Then like, were there any ways you could do it? Sort of like, did they have any silver bullets for distributed collaboration? Not really, but he did say this very nice quote, which was that he wanted to live creatively without walls and work with people all around the world. This was very much during COVID. And he said, this is what's happening right now. And I think that for me was one of the most positive things that came out of COVID. Was for the first time, it forced us all the time to look beyond the physical walls that we were in and connect with people both that we would otherwise have seen in the office, or we would otherwise have seen at conferences, or maybe we never would have seen because we never would have ever been in the same room. And so I think that looking beyond our walls aspect was really important. And for all it's bad, that 2020 was a year that forcefully showed us what could be. And I really hope that we can take the best out of that and do better in the future. So the last thing I want to do is show a short like mini video that we put together in TFOM, which gives a little bit of insight into the kind of things that we think, and well, they're already possible now, and we hope there'll be more uptaken in the future. Let me stop that.
What if we could meet and collaborate with people from all around the world, regardless of where you're physically located?
What if technology allowed the same togetherness with others informally, being together socially even while at a distance?
What if you could give a talk and have all the benefits of being on stage, but with an audience distributed around the world?
What if we could link real data to virtual objects and bring new ideas to life with collaborators from around the world?
What if technology could allow you to experience different places and cultures with your friends and colleagues without ever having to travel anywhere?
Avete mai immaginato di fare una presentazione nella vostra lingua preferita e che tutti i partecipanti la potessero seguire nella loro? What if you could give a talk in your preferred language and everyone watching could experience it in theirs?
What if we can meet in a place that goes beyond being there, somewhere humans cannot reach?
So thank you very much for having me speak, and I'm looking forward to the questions and discussing. Thanks.
So that was quite inspiring. You give us much to think about and to process, to employ it in our own context. So yes, we move now to the question and answer sections. There is a button at the bottom of your Zoom window that says Q&A. So if you type there a question, then we can ask Vanessa. So we currently already have one question there. Veronique Deluy asks, can you elaborate on asynchronous communication, how to solve or mitigate the problem of different time zones in online meetings?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the things that we've previously covered where it's like, well, it's very hard to get around the fact that the planet is round. And one of the things we've seen, you know, so as soon as you have people from the three sort of zones, like say you have the Americas and you have Europe and then you had Asia Pacific, it gets very difficult. I guess one of the key things we've seen is to have those asynchronous platforms available. For example, with TFOM, we have people in different time zones, although kind of a little concentrated on the Asia Pacific at the moment. But what we have is a Slack space, which means there are, you know, there's chats available. I think people often say, well, do you need something like a chat platform if you have email? But the thing about email is it's not transparent. So if you have open channels that are themed on things, then even if someone's asleep or they're not around at the time, they can come back and engage with it later. So that's actually how a lot of our discussions and a lot of interactions take place, is having that. So I think in one way it can be solved with technology. The other way is, you know, there are solutions like, I think it's better if you have a regular meeting that's international to not have it at a fixed time. We've seen solutions, things like rotating the time. So it's all, you know, it's bad for someone always, but like it sort of changes and it doesn't bake in that disadvantage. Yeah, so I think those are sort of solutions. There's another way is, I remember this email I got from someone when we were doing the future of meetings, which was, I always thought the future of meetings would be no meetings at all. And that stuck with me because it's like, well, do you need a meeting? So that's the other way, I think, is if it's really time zone challenging, then it's best to try to avoid meeting live unless it's something that really needs meeting live. So status updates, go. Nobody needs a status update live if it's 3 a.m. in the morning. But if it's a discussion or it's a decision or something like that, then yeah, sure. On a one-off or when it matters, I'm sure hopefully people would be able to make that sacrifice. So hopefully that gives us some ideas. But yeah, it's a good question though. It's very hard.
Thanks, Vanessa. While we wait for more questions coming in on the Q&A button, maybe ask one question myself. Our previous speaker, Professor David Hill from France, he was putting a lot of emphasis on the environmental impact of online systems. So he was thinking more about data centers, internet communication, all that. But I guess also the tools that you have been advocating here, they cost energy, right? So is there a metric for that, or how can we estimate the impact of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So actually, so there are a few TFOM people in the audience, and one of the person who spent the most time thinking about that is Glenn. For the TFOM symposium, we did that completely online. So what we wanted to do was say, all right, how much would that have cost? And that's looking at that full picture, like you say, like how much did the internet cost? How much did the data storage and all of the data transfer to all the different people that were watching, the power usage? Like we maxed out, like we tried to make it as much carbon as possible. And that was about 1,100 attendees, although we had like 200 active at any given time. So we were very generous with trying to get that digital carbon emissions. We still only got 1.4 tons, which is a lot less than even one flight domestically in Australia. So I think it is, we did have trouble getting those numbers, like as in trying to, we had to pull them from different reports. And so it's not as easy to do as it is perhaps with like in-person stuff where it's like basically mostly the plane. But yeah, it is definitely possible. And it's something that I think can be done. But the other thing that's a really important point, this is something that's also in the literature, it is not anywhere near as much as the associated cost of in-person. So we were looking, the different numbers are like 100 times less, 1,000 times less. It depends a little bit on the nature of the meeting. And, you know, there's a lot of arguments to be made that we need to look at the full carbon cycle of everything. So like, how much does it cost to make a plane? How much does it, and how long is it used? Or how much does it cost to make a VR headset? And how long is it used? Phones and stuff. We're not doing that for everything. That's probably important too. But I think the key point is while there is a carbon cost to digital, it's not anywhere close to the in-person equivalent. Supercomputing is another matter, like, but we're seeing a lot of those transition to renewable energy in Australia, at least, and I think elsewhere. So then the carbon cost of that is a lot lower, and that's true of data centers as well, I think, but maybe not as quickly.
So yeah, online meetings are really orders of magnitudes of taking a plane.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned mixed reality tools a couple of times. Is there one that you could advise us, like go and try that out right now?
That's a good question. Because I guess people in the chat can't suggest things either. The one we've been working with the most lately is spatial. So this is the reason we're doing it is because it's you get most of the functionality for free, and it's quite accessible. So it's you can go in a VR headset or in the web browser or on a phone app. So it's one of the most because that's been important to us, that we don't create new forms of inaccessibility by going into VR. So it has a lot of problems, but it is, it's a very low barrier of entry because you don't need to pay anything. You can just go and experiment and try it and connect it with VR. I think that's a pretty good one to check out. We've used one called Glue, which I think again has a free mode that people can just try. That's not on the web browser, but it does have both desktop apps for Mac and Windows and VR. So some of the good ones are cross-platform, so that yeah, and then we try other ones. Those are probably the two most worky ones, I would say. There's a lot of social VR platforms. We've spent a lot of time in an app called Walkabout Mini Golf. So in fact, actually, it was funny, I was watching that video, and I'm the one that says, what if we could be together socially with people while at a distance? That was my avatar. I had COVID at the time. I'm just thinking about it. That's why I sounded so nasally, because I was in isolation with COVID while we were having to film. So no one wanted to be near me at that time. So it was lucky we had VR. But anyway, yeah, it's that app's been a really cool one for the social interaction.
All right, great. If there are no other questions from the audience, then I think we're gonna thank you again, Vanessa, and let you go into the night in Australia.
Yes. Yeah, it's 11 p.m. here. So that's the thing. I mean, one thing I would say, going back to those time zones, is don't assume when someone wants to be awake. Because we've seen huge flexibility in that. Some people are morning people. So if you ask them, what are the hours you could do a meeting? It could be from 6 a.m. to say like 6 p.m. because they crash at 8 p.m. because they get up so early. And then I'm the other end of that. So if you try to schedule a meeting with me before 11 a.m., I work on Perth time. So I'm saying 11 Sydney time, which is 8 a.m. Perth time. Chances are low, but I can go up to 1 a.m.-ish at the latest, but not coherent. Giving a talk 10 p.m. is easier. But yeah, so I think asking people, doing those sort of polls and that sort of stuff is quite important.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. It was wonderful to talk.
Thanks for having me. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
really nice to be here. Thanks. Yeah.